This is Nuance. I'm Mike Scala, joined as always by Jay Carter, the chair of BLM Tokyo, and the hip hop MC Timid. What's going on, Jay?
Round two.
Yeah, we tried to go a second ago, and I guess it didn't take. Sometimes, you gotta try a couple of times in life.
Okay, try again.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's good. Like I said, it's morning here, so just getting up and getting ready for this nice discussion.
Very nice. It's always like a look into the future. And now it's like deja vu because we just said this before, but every time we talk, it's like looking into tomorrow because it's Wednesday in Japan and it's Tuesday here in the US.
Right. And it's funny. It comes up often when I send people happy birthday messages. They're like, oh, thank you, but it's tomorrow. I'm like, yeah, it's tomorrow here though.
So that means you're already older than you think you are.
Yeah. I've already seen your birthday. It's already passed.
Wasn't really too special, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Calm down. Don't get too excited.
Wow.
But yeah. So it looks like it's gonna be a good weather morning. We've had some good weather recently. Particularly noticeable since last week. We were in the middle of a typhoon.
There was a tornado warning in Rockaway last night, and the weather got really bad here, actually, and Howard Beach even.
Does New York have tornadoes?
Yes, not really. It's not known for being a tornado epicenter, but we do get them. I guess epicenter would be more of an earthquake. And I'm mixing my terminology here, but you know what I mean.
Right. Wow.
It's not the area that we think of as being the quote unquote or proverbial epicenter of tornado activity in the world or in the US.
Right.
But yeah, you do get some wild stuff. I mean, obviously even hurricanes, right? We're not known for hurricanes, but we do get them. Look at Hurricane Sandy, etc.
Right. And it's similar with earthquakes too. At least I didn't notice any when I was living there. And it was kind of strange because when I was there, I went with Mikey D. I took Mikey D with me to do a short tour in Japan. And so we did performances in Tokyo, Osaka. We did some photo shoots and radio appearances and stuff. And this was in 2011. This was like 5 or 6 months after the massive tsunami and hurricane and earthquake and all that stuff that Japan had. And so he was concerned about earthquakes. And it was like, because they would still had aftershocks for months. And so, we went out there and we had a great time. And there were, he didn't feel any earthquakes out there. And we got back to New York, and within that week was when New York had that earthquake.
Right. There you go.
It's like, oh my God. Yeah, you got it when you got back home.
Yeah. That's how it goes sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, New York, it doesn't have a lot of earthquakes and extreme weather events, but we do get stuff, right? It's, it happens.
Japan has an earthquake season, so to speak. Yeah, because it's on the Ring of Fire, so yeah, they get them often. But at least not where I'm at. They're very rare where I'm at.
Well, it's all this like hellfire and brimstone type talk. Why don't we go a little bit more pleasant and speak about the Queens County Young Democrats fundraiser that I attended, their summer bash. And it was actually nice because it was outdoors in a kind of post-COVID world. And we were able to do this again. COVID kind of put a pause on events like this. And it was good to get back out there with people and network politically, talk to some people that some people that you're just meeting for the first time. And, QCYD is a great organization that we've been accustomed to and we've known for 10 years now. In 2012, we attended a meeting together. I guess this will be a year post your Mikey D tour in Japan.
Yeah, I remember that meeting. That was our first time going there. That was during the first campaign. And we were like, okay, we need to get in the mix and see what's going on. And yeah, that was one of the first time we went to QCYD.
Right. And that was in Jamaica, Queens, right by the train station, right? It was like the JFK Center or something like that. They called that place.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So it was actually a really good event this past week that I attended, and they were honoring some people who did some good things in the borough. So I want to shout out Aminta and Danny Randell, everyone who was honored. But some good discussions were had privately. But someone asked me an interesting question that I wanted to touch on, which was basic advice for running for office. Just any insight that someone might have who's been through it, as someone who's won a Democratic primary and so forth. They wanted to kind of know what my experience was and what I tell someone who's looking to do it themselves. And I kind of said facetiously, you have to hate yourself. And the person reacted and said, well, I would think you'd have to love yourself. And yeah, I mean, I didn't mean it literally. I think you do have to love yourself in a sense. You have to have high self-esteem, or at least not let things bother you. Have a thick skin, right? Be able to take, because you are signing up for criticism and really beyond that. I think it's sad to say, but you're kind of signing up for being lied about and just having mud thrown at you. And so that's why I said you have to hate yourself, because who really wants that? But you need to have, I don't know if masochism is the right word, but a certain tolerance for that. It's a sacrifice. You have to be willing to sacrifice, because that's not something a normal person goes to. I think a lot of people think of it like, all right, I'm going to run for office and do something good for my community, which is great. And that's what you should be thinking. But you also are signing up for that ugliness that comes with politics these days. And that's not something that most people, I think, have the Constitution for.
Right, or that they necessarily expect until they get into it, and it's like, whoa, wait, what's going on here?
Right.
Yeah, I think it's something you definitely need to be aware of, that you're putting yourself out in the public, and there are people who have different agendas, people who want the spot that you're going for, and they're willing to do whatever or say whatever to get there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that you do have to give up a lot of what would be considered by most to be a normal life. I mean, I know everyone's definition of that is going to be different. Everyone's going to have a different idea of that, but it really is a sacrifice. I mean, just giving yourself to the public means you don't have the private life that I think most people enjoy. Now, maybe some people don't care about having privacy, but I think most people do. And I think, even someone like myself who comes from kind of that public background. I mean, I was in hip hop, so I was used to putting myself out there and not really being a private person, trying to make myself a public figure at that time. I was used to being in the public eye or trying to present myself as a public person. Even for someone like me who was in that spot, I think it was a bit of a shock to the system. Not saying it was something I couldn't handle, but it was beyond what I think most people would expect until you're actually in that position. It's not something you can prepare for, I think, just by reading about it or by talking to other people. Until you experience it, it's not something you're going to be used to.
Right. Because then when you're out there like that, everyone has an opinion about you and anything that you say. And, and it can be taken the wrong way. It could be misrepresented, all of that. And normally, when someone takes something the wrong way about us or says something about us, we have a certain type of reaction, a certain type of, it affects us in a certain way. But when you're in that mix and that's constant, you have to realize that and deal with that.
Or even this, having to care what people think. Because if you're a purely private person, you can say, well, if someone doesn't like me, I don't care. I don't have to associate with them in any way. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect me in any way. I'll just mind my own business. Who cares what people think about me? But if you're in politics and you're trying to get elected, you do have to care to a certain degree. Now, you shouldn't let it affect you and cripple you emotionally or mentally or physically, right? But you have to care how people perceive you, and what you say matters more in that, in that sense, in the sense of how it's going to be received, how it's going to be interpreted by other people. That matters in this arena. And that's not something that's normal, I don't think, in normal day-to-day life that people deal with.
Right. Because, you are stepping into asking for that to be like, I'm here to represent and I'm taking on this responsibility. And so part of the way that they see you is, part of what you're presenting, what you're putting out. And you do have to kind of pay attention. Of course, there are going to be some people who are just straight up like, haters, so to speak. And they're straight up, opposing anything you do just because of whatever party you are in or whatever issue you're talking about or whatever. But in general, you're stepping up to say, I want to represent everybody, and that includes you as well. And so you have to take some of that in.
Right. And think about that. Just the idea of someone, like you said, hating on you or just being negative towards you constantly, their whole mission politically, or maybe even they get obsessed with it. And I've got a story about that, how people get so obsessed with politics we can get into. But people make it their mission to take you down, and then you have to be gracious and say, well, I'm representing you as well, and so I'm also looking out for your best interests, even though your best interests are directly adverse to mine in many ways.
Right.
The nature of the beast, and that's just different. It's, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing necessarily, it's just the way the system is, but it's very different from normal life what most people go through. If you're putting yourself in this position, be prepared for something just totally different that's probably going to shock you. And again, I think a lot of people understand this intellectually, but until you're there, you're not really prepared for it emotionally or just the practicality of what it entails until you do it. And that's why I said kind of facetiously, you have to hate yourself. Just meaning you've got to sign up for a lot of nasty stuff that most people would never have to go through, but it's a sacrifice. You're doing it not for your own benefit. You're doing it because you think that you're part of something greater than yourself, that you'll take the hit for something bigger. If you can help the community, if you can help the people, then it's not about you. And that's a great thing, to be about something better than yourself. And people can feel good and find fulfillment in that, which is awesome. Right. But again, there is a sacrifice, I think, to get to that point.
And that, I think that was, to me, one of the enjoyable parts about the campaigning, was when we got to speak to people directly and have those discussions and hear about their concerns and have those things. When we did the meet and greets and we did the when we were going door to door talking to people. Remember the elderly couple that like invited us in and was like,
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that actually happens frequently when you're campaigning, knocking on doors. And that's also something that's not normal. I mean, knocking on doors isn't nearly as bad as calling up and asking people for money all day long, because if you're a normal person, you don't want to do that. People have pride, and most people in society are taught from a young age not to do that, right? To work hard and to not rely on others for money. But when you're in politics, that comes with the territory. You have to ask people for money for your campaign. And a lot of people don't realize how much money goes into running these campaigns. And there's a movement to get money out of politics, which I think is very valid. But the system we have now does require raising a lot of money. And so that's a very awkward thing for most normal people, I think, being on the phone 8 hours a day, essentially begging for money. Who wants to do that? But right. I'm digressing anyway. The point about getting invited into people's homes, yeah, that's something that's actually a very positive thing that you experience when you go knocking on doors, talking to people about their issues, and really making friends with all your neighbors. I mean, that's really a great thing to do.
Yeah. So, yes, I mean, that's a lot of information for someone trying to run for office. So there's a lot of good and there's some uncomfortable that goes with it as well,
to say the least. From a practical standpoint, because I did mention this at the event, aside from the philosophical stuff about self-sacrifice and hating yourself and having thick skin and all that kind of stuff, just purely practical stuff. Having money, having resources to do it, because you raise money to run a campaign. But in New York, and different laws have different states have different laws on this. In New York, you cannot use campaign money as living expenses. There was a law that was passed that allowed campaign money to go towards childcare, because that was a point of contention. So there are areas now where they're trying to make accommodations for this. But generally speaking, you cannot live off your campaign expenses. And so you have to be able to support yourself while you're running for office. And running for office really is a full-time job. In fact, if you're going to do it well, it's 2 or 3 full-time jobs, maybe 4 full-time jobs. I mean, you're not sleeping. You always have campaign responsibilities constantly. So how are you going to support yourself in this? Which unfortunately is why you see wealthy people in positions of power in this country, because they're the ones who have the means to do it while everyone else has to work. I mean, we talked about last week, people are working 2 or 3 jobs now to take care of themselves. Where is someone going to find the time now to have 2 or 3, or the equivalent of 2, 3, or 4 full-time jobs while they run a campaign? So you have to be able to support yourself, however that means. I mean, oftentimes, for me at least, it's meant raising money, like saving up money, so I was able to support myself while I campaigned.
Right. Yeah, it can be very expensive. So.
Right. No, absolutely. and I would say prohibitively so. And that's why you often see not only wealthy people get elected, but the system then skewed towards wealthy people's interests and not the working people, because it's very difficult for working class people to get elected and to even be at that table, even have a seat at that table. And forget getting elected, even before you get to that point, showing up at the meetings. I mean, we have things in New York City like participatory budgeting, where the people can vote on how their taxpayer money is spent in their area, which is great. But even to go to a meeting like that or a community board meeting, you have to have the means to do so. I mean, if you're working days and nights trying to put food on the table for your family, how are you going to have the time to do that? How are you going to be able to organize your community politically to get change affected? Unfortunately, it's people with disposable income and with the resources at their disposal who can do this because they're just practically able to. And that's, I think, a big fundamental problem with our system.
And people that have a little bit more of time freedom, where they can reorganize things to suit how, whatever it is that they're trying to do.
Time is money. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why when we talk about things like inadequate transportation in South Queens, the Rockaway, Sour Beach, Ozone Park, sometimes people don't understand why that's such a critical issue. Like, oh, who cares? You spend a few extra minutes to an hour getting to work. Time is money. People who are commuting quickly from their job to their homes might have more time to go to those meetings and to organize and to do all those other things, maybe even run for office. People who are spending extra time, I mean, it adds up. Every day adds up. You add on every day, every week, every year. It's taking time out of people's days, which in turn takes money out of their pockets directly and indirectly.
Right. Absolutely. So yeah, so there's definitely a lot to think about when going in. But again, there's that positive effect on the community and that effort, that interest, I think is a good thing.
Right. It is a good thing. And I really do think that you have to have, some people say an ego, whatever it is, but you have to be willing to sacrifice for the greater good, especially if your heart's going to be in the right place. I think that's the way to approach it. Go into it knowing that it's going to be hard on you. It's going to be hard on your family. You're probably not going to make as much money as you thought. I mean, like for me, for example, I could spend all my time in private practice as a lawyer and make a lot more money than if I'm just focused on saving up enough money for the next campaign and then basically spending all my savings while I run for office. I mean, that's a sacrifice. That's a real tangible sacrifice I'm making, but I'm doing it because I believe in it. And I think it's something bigger than me that I want to be a part of. And I think I can contribute in that way. So if that's your mentality, that's great. But, just understand that you are making that sacrifice.
And I think that's a good point. Like you have to, have that belief in that this is something that's greater than you. And, you're going to, like I said, sacrifice to be a part of it or to contribute or to do something that you think that you can do. And so you have to know that when you're going in.
Right. It's not easy. It's very difficult. And maybe it shouldn't be easy, but I do think that there are reforms that should be looked at to make it more accessible to most people. I think right now the problem is that the system is just generally inaccessible to most. And that's not even only speaking of running for office. It's just talking about being engaged in the political process in a meaningful way.
Right. Yeah. It should be accessible to a wide variety of people. Not necessarily like super easy, but it should be accessible. It shouldn't be, as you said, where only, the rich or the privileged or whoever have access to it, because if we're talking about a representative government, then everyone should be able to get access running for office as well. Right.
That's how the system was designed, at least on paper, in theory. It's supposed to be for the people, by the people. It doesn't always work that way, as we know, but that's what we strive for in this country. And New York City, for example, and other places do things like matching funds, which is supposed to make the system more accessible, where they'll match every dollar that you raise. And it's 8-to-1 now in New York City, which is very robust. But there are still flaws that come with it. And again, room for reform, certainly.
Right. Yeah. Hey, maybe we'll see someone, a super massive social media following in their area and then just run a campaign with no money.
People try that and it doesn't work. And there are reasons for that. I mean, we can start getting into the political science, you know,
Right.
that works more at the national level, believe it or not, at higher levels when more people are engaged and paying attention and, start looking at like debates and the news 24/7 covering everyone's social media feeds and everyone, millions of people are retweeting things. It's much more different when you're talking about localized politics, and politics is local and most change happens at the local level. Most people who are voting aren't engaged with let's say a city council candidate social media in that way. Maybe they're following the presidential candidates, but they're not following your local city. And honestly, most of the voters who are voting in these hyperlocal primaries are of a certain demographic who aren't really on social media, or at least not Twitter, not on a lot of these platforms. They tend to skew older. Presidential politics, talking about large scale elections, you have more people voting. Younger people get more involved, and it's just a higher percentage of the population is involved. When you start talking about very local elections, it's a very niche audience. It's a very niche demographic, and it's not your people who are just reading tweets all day. It's really not that. It's more, they tend to be elderly, church going, or religious type folks.
Yeah. So, well, I think if anyone's interested in doing so, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to do. If you're interested in trying to run for office or working on campaigns, I think it would be a very worthwhile thing.
Yeah, if your heart is in the right place, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
People should strive to do.
Yeah, don't get on there wanting to be crazy and run the world.
Speaking of crazy, or maybe not, there was a report that came out that in New York, there is a proposal to have devices pre-installed on cars that would use the car's GPS system to figure out what the speed limit was, where the car was, and then automatically prevent the car from going too fast as compared to the speed limit in that area. So you would be physically prevented from speeding, essentially. Now, there is some talk, some lawmakers and policymakers are saying that New York State has the authority to do so. Of course, I'm sure this will be challenged by the courts, but just what do we think? Do we think that this is a good idea? Obviously, there's been a move to lower speed limits and to even discourage people from driving because there's a lot of people citing fatalities caused by vehicles and so forth. We talked about speed cameras on here. We had a very lengthy discussion. A lot of people weighed in on what the thoughts were about 24/7 speed cameras. I've got to be honest, not very popular in this part of town. So to me, this seems like another flavor of that, moving in that same direction. I would say making it prohibitively difficult for a driver to get around. And in an area, like I said, in this part of Queens, until public transit is benefited and improved to the point where we're not reliant on vehicles, you're really just hurting us here.
Yeah, I think I don't like that idea. I mean, imagine you're driving around and you're in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, and then you shift into like a 25-mile, and then all of a sudden your speed just drops because you can't go any faster, and then you got to wait till you get out of that. It just I understand this idea of trying to curb speeding, but I think that's very restrictive. I think that's very intrusive. There are some circumstances where you might need to, like rushing your wife to the hospital, it was about to give birth, she might not be able to take the 25-mile-an-hour the whole way there. And sure, you're speeding. I understand that, but I don't like that. I don't like it.
Right. Emergency situations. I mean, what if, God forbid, you're being chased by someone trying to kill you or something? Who knows, right? I mean, there could be situations where you have to get away. And in fact, the law allows for that. The law allows for emergency. When you talk about a speed limit, that's under normal circumstances. But sometimes there are emergency circumstances that require you to go faster than that speed. Under this, there would be no accounting for that. So really, you could make an argument that this device would be against the law in a sense, or would prevent you from even accessing the law as it currently stands.
Right. It just, to me, it's another effort to try to, I don't know. One, I think to sanitize life. Not everything is going to be perfect to the letter of whatever rule or law it is. It's just not, life is not like that. And this takes away people's, autonomy to a degree. And it's like they're overlooming, just watching over you. It's some 1984 type stuff. It's I don't know, it's kind of crazy to me. I don't think it's a good thing. Now, what are the proponents of the law like? What is the benefit that they're saying that this will provide?
They're saying it would curb people from speeding and killing people speeding. It would reduce fatalities.
But I mean, if you're hit at 25 miles an hour versus 40 miles an hour, you're still really messed up.
Right, but that was what the whole Vision Zero thing was, right? They claimed that if you get hit at 25 miles an hour, you're much more likely to survive than if you got hit at 35 or 40 miles an hour. They seem to show or believe through whatever data they had that was some kind of turning point or tipping point where 25 seemed like you don't want to say safe, but if you got hit at 25, it wasn't nearly as fatal as just a little bit above 25.
Right. Yeah. I don't, I think what would be a better alternative is that, people have to be a little bit more vigilant. We get to, for the driver's side, when we first start learning how to drive, we first get that learner's permit, we first get that license, everything is like 10 and 2 and being very careful and cautious. Fast forward 6 months later, you're driving with your knee, you got a burrito in one hand and you're changing the radio. We forget what sort of responsibility, and we get so comfortable with it that, we just become acclimated to it. And then on the pedestrian side, I think some people forget to look both ways crossing the street that we learn as a kid. And
right.
We can't depend on law and lawmakers to buffer everything in life for us.
Right. And I was going to make that point as well about pedestrians looking both ways. Someone said to me that they were in favor of the 24/7 speed cameras because people would be crossing the street and cars would be speeding down the street and hitting them. And as terrible as that is, I wanted to ask the question. In fact, I did ask the question, well, why aren't they looking before crossing the street? I mean, I'm not saying that they're in the wrong, that they're on the wrong for being hit. No, obviously people shouldn't be speeding and hitting people crossing the street. But is the answer always stop people from driving? What about teaching people to be more careful when they cross as well?
Right. Absolutely. And of course, there's on the flip side, there is the question of children who you can't really expect that they're going to be able to look out for themselves in that way. And so we do, as adults, as a society, should take precautions to look out for them. But I don't think this is the best way to do something like that. And oh yeah, in the comment, Nixon mentioned about people staring at their phones while they're driving, which is a big issue. Again, I think this is more of a society. It's not something that should be legislated out, though.
Yeah, Lixa also said feels too much like Big Brother, and it does. And honestly, it's just a movement to punish drivers or to discourage people from driving in New York. And some people might say that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's really not. I mean, I talked about how even candidates running for office, there were candidates who talked about we're in a transition era from the era of cars in New York. I mean, that was a talking point that was used in debates during New York City elections last year. You see people say, even, Andre, I talked to, who we've had on here a few times, he said that I'm too trusting of people to make good decisions behind the wheel. Like, he thinks that basically we should take the cynical approach and say people can't be trusted to drive responsibly, so let's get them out their cars. I don't think that's the right move, especially not now. And I understand their environmental concerns. I understand all of that. But look at where we are currently in South Queens in particular, and in many parts of the city, but I'm using this as an example because it's where I'm from and I represent. We don't have that public transit infrastructure in place where we can just replace cars. And we talked about the effects on seniors. We talked about the effects on people who just can't get around the same way right now. That's not where we live, and car culture is the big buzz term now. And people want to say, we want to move away from car culture. How about a culture where our public transit system is taken care of and built up and really not behind the rest of the country and the rest of the world here in New York? Let's get to a place where we don't need cars as much, and then we can start having that conversation. But right now, all you're doing is punishing people.
Right. And that's, that, and that's what I think we mentioned before too. Like, yeah, like if you get the infrastructure in place and that allow people to be able to utilize bikes or walking or whatnot comfortably and easily, then you'll have more people that might opt for those things as well. But just to take away the cars with no alternative really isn't a solution. It's
right. And think about just a neighborhood now. So people say, all right, you could take buses or trains. What if you want to get to your local neighborhood supermarket and you're a senior citizen, let's say you can't walk, it's too far for you to walk. And again, we're talking a place like Queens where it's more spread out in many areas, not like Manhattan where there's a store in every corner and all that kind of stuff. What if it's a half a mile or more to your store or your drugstore, your pharmacy, your hair covers, anywhere you have to go? How are you going to get there on public transit the way the system currently is?
Right. So it needs to, and a lot of design in the US as far as cities and communities, it was based around car travel. So, it's a lot of places required. Like, you don't have, you have whole, especially suburbs, you have whole suburbs where you've got to drive to get to the grocery store, or to get to the post office or whatever. There's nothing within walking distance for it because it's expected that you're going to have, cars and whatnot.
Right. Well, most of the country is very spread out. In fact, even most of New York State is spread out that way. New York City is a little bit different. And in New York City, you have the clash of people who are from Manhattan, who have that more Manhattan-centric mentality. And it is only Manhattan, but it certainly is prevalent in Manhattan and in areas where it's more built up and dense, right? And then you have areas like in Queens and Staten Island and other places where that's not the case. You can't have that one-size-fits-all approach even within New York City. So you can say most places in New York City don't require cars. Maybe that's true. It's not true of every place in New York City. And we have to be very mindful of that.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of this proposal. It doesn't, I understand what they want to do. They want to lessen traffic fatalities and accidents, and lower speeds can help. But, I think there are other ways to do it. It needs to be, some more driver education and vigilance, public education and vigilance, and just understand that, we've got to look out for ourselves and for what we're doing while we're out there.
Right. And I think we need to be thinking of all of these issues in terms of, all right, how can we make things better for everyone? How can we incentivize people to behave in a better way or a way that's more sustainable for our planet without punishing them? I think we're so quick to punish or to have these punitive measures or these measures that are going to hurt people or take things away from people or make things more difficult. I don't think that needs to be our philosophy on this. I think it needs to be more, how do we incentivize better behavior versus banning behavior we don't like? So if you had a better public transit system, for example, fewer people would be driving, but then you would still be able to have some people drive who need to, but you wouldn't be as reliant as a culture or as a city or whatever on cars because the system would be working better at that point. And I think that's what we need to be looking at. How can we make the system work better for everyone instead of saying, all right, we think there are too many people driving. The solution is let's just make it impossible for them to drive. No, because now you're just punishing them and you're not giving them any alternatives and you're not making things better. You're actually making the system worse.
Right. And this idea that the government can just go in and turn off your speed on restrict the speed on your private vehicle is very uncomfortable. I mentioned 1984. Lisa mentioned Big Brother. I mean, it's very uncomfortable. And what other things would they think? Oh, well, we did it with this. So how about we do it with this? And it's like,
right. Where does it lead? And I made that point in the paper. Oh, sorry, I just got a text message from our guest. I'll follow up on that in a second. So no, I made the point in the paper that basically if we're trying to move in a more progressive direction as a society, everyone talks about progressive change. Going back to 1984 and Big Brother seems regressive. I think we're moving backwards by doing that.
Right. Yeah. You know, especially when you're talking about, you know, just kind of people's freedoms and their personal choices. And these are, you know, again, personal vehicles, personal devices, personal items. Yeah, I think it's an overreach to say that we are going to be able to just go right in and restrict it whenever we want to. So
No, I agree. Well,
what's with the guests? Are they jumping in?
yeah, I'm trying to work this out here. They said they forgot that they were on for today and they're on the community board Zoom. So I'm not sure if they're going to hop on, but we'll be on here for a little bit longer if the guest wants to come on and join us before you wrap up.
So let's get into the poll from last week. You had some results on that.
Yeah, so mine was pretty one-sided actually. It was 89% to 11% in favor of only asking aspiring lawyers in New York to disclose criminal convictions as adults, as opposed to now where they ask for all arrests and even juvenile offenses that might have been committed. So people are saying move away from asking about everything and only ask about the adult convictions, which I think makes sense. But I gotta say this, when
I think convictions is a key to me, and not just arrests, period, but convictions,
right,
where they're found guilty of something. I think that's more of a key.
Yeah, and when I was applying to be a lawyer myself, first of all, before you even take the bar and do the character and fitness to get your license, when you apply for law school, they ask you these questions as well. And it's not just, by the way, arrests. They ask about any disciplinary items on your record at school. You know, were you ever suspended? Were you ever expelled? Did you have any kind of discipline at school? And then when I remember when you apply for the bar, they ask you about any lawsuits. Were you ever sued, or were you ever involved in any kind of litigation at all? So they're really asking about everything. And in some places, in fact, I was kind of doing a little bit of a survey on this. For example, Virginia stopped asking about mental health status a few years ago, but that used to be a question that they asked too. So they really try to ask about everything to try to figure out the kind of person you are, what kind of trouble you've ever been in, you know, everything about you, your background. And maybe it is too intrusive, I don't know, but they are trying to figure out who you're going to be, because you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be an officer of the court. And a lot of it is about consistency too. They want to make sure that you're not lying to them. So that's why they say it's better to disclose it and explain it. And I Google this and I kind of, you know, see what people are talking about. And some people say that, oh, you know, when I was a kid, I shot a BB gun at a gas station door and I got some, you know, something on my record as, you know, some juvenile offense or whatever. Do I really need to disclose that? And is that going to prevent me from being a lawyer? You know, and the advice or the response generally is disclose everything. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be a lawyer because you have something like that in your past, but it's bad if they uncover it later and then it turns out you weren't being honest about it. So that becomes an issue, that if they find something in your background that you didn't disclose, then why weren't you forthcoming about it? But for the most part, these issues in your past, if they're relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, and if they're a long time ago, aren't going to preclude you from being a lawyer. But like we said, a lot of people just don't apply because they're afraid that they won't get through, or they're just embarrassed that it's on their record. They don't want to disclose that for whatever reason.
Right. Be honest. Was that BB gun question yours?
Was that what?
That was
BB gun question?
gun?
No, no. I actually had really nothing, thank God, like that in my background. I had a pretty easy time of it.
Yeah, and actually this did kind of well on YouTube. It's almost the poll was at almost 1,000 views on YouTube for this poll, and we got about 2-to-1 thumbs up on the poll on whether they should continue to ask. So there was a response that said yes, they should continue to ask, and with the 2-to-1 thumbs up, I would take that to mean that they should continue.
You never know. They could
You
just be
never know.
liking the poll question itself, liking the poll question. You know,
Right, you never
they actually
know.
voted in terms of one option or the other.
Right, but we did get comments that said yes, they should continue.
They should
So
continue or they should change it.
continue.
It should
Yeah,
continue the way it is.
yeah. Do you think they should continue to ask inspiring? That was the question, and the answer was yes. Just a simple yes, no explanation or anything, just yes.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I was looking at some other states, like I said, and it is common that they ask some variation of this, but the language does vary from state to state. In Massachusetts, and please don't take this as legal advice, like if you're going to take the bar in Massachusetts, do your research before, don't rely on this. I just did a quick glance at these applications, and it seemed like they were using language like felony charges in Massachusetts, whereas in New York, it was like any arrest. So those are different things, and people have questions about,
Yeah.
does it cover it, what doesn't, do I have to disclose this, or don't I have to disclose it? But, you know, being charged with the felony is very different from being arrested. And then in some places, I think it might have been New Jersey, if I'm not mistaken, they said, if it's a Class C misdemeanor for a traffic violation, specifically, you don't have to disclose it. So I guess that might have been like a speeding ticket or something of that, some, you know, maybe reckless driving to a certain degree, I don't know. But they have these different applications with different wordings, and it just depends on how it's worded. But different states will ask the questions a little bit differently. In general, they do ask pretty broad question, right? They ask, they basically trying to uncover all this dirt that might be in your past.
Right. Yeah. Well, to me, it still says that the thing is still, you know, if it's not required in other states, then it seems that it wouldn't be necessary to be asked.
But other states do ask. I mean, I even looked at Vermont. I was trying to do a sampling of, okay, let's take some very liberal states, let's take some more conservative states. I looked at Texas. For the most part, they ask these questions. They just word them a little bit differently. And some have, like I said, I think Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken, Massachusetts was about felony charges. So it doesn't have to be a conviction, but if you were indicted, if you brought up on charges on a felony, now even that might be too extreme or too far for some, because there's this idea that we're innocent until proven guilty. And so why should we have to disclose a charge if we were not convicted of it? Why should that be seen as a strike against us? But again, it doesn't mean you can't be a lawyer. So what you're supposed to do is disclose it and then explain it. And they don't recommend that you write pages on it, but just explain what happened. If it was a false accusation, say that, you know?
Right. Yeah. So in the chat, we got a question saying, who's handling all that information?
Well, it's the bar. Each state has its own board that does this, character and fitness, and it's a committee. They process the applications, they do background checks, they get all your data, all your information, then they interview you, and they make recommendations as to whether you should be admitted to the bar or not.
I wonder if they're keeping a record. They have like a big database of every lawyer and all the convictions and things just sitting around somewhere.
Well, no, they do a whole comprehensive background check. So when you apply to be a lawyer, they pull that information up.
Right.
I was reading an article earlier where it said, all right, let's say you don't disclose something and you get away with it now. You become a lawyer. You're a lawyer for 15 years. Everything seems great. Then all of a sudden you become a judge. And now there's a second round of background checks when you're becoming a judge. They can go back and look at your law school admissions process and your application to the bar, to character and fitness. And then at that point, realize that you didn't disclose something, you were dishonest on something. And that could disqualify you from being a judge even.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it sounds like you said, you know, or like they said, it's better in that instance to think, you know, disclose and then explain.
Right.
Even before getting to the question of whether they should ask in the first place, if that's where it is right now, disclose and explain is probably the best course of action, while this is being decided over here whether or not they should be asking at all.
Right, but just like we said, when you run for office right now, it requires spending all your time raising money. That's a system you have to be in if you want to win. There's also a valid conversation about changing that system. We're striving to change the system. So
right.
The question still is in New York. Other states have this going on too, but we focus on New York because we're in New York. So should we change the system in New York? Should we not ask people who are aspiring to be lawyers to disclose all of this information. I mean, even when it comes to, for example, civil lawsuits, and it all ties together, because when I was applying to be a lawyer, no one had ever sued me. I was never involved in a lawsuit. So I can easily say, no, never. Now, if I was applying to be a lawyer, yeah, because when you're in politics, you get sued all the time. So that would be something I would have to disclose now if I was applying to be a lawyer. Were you ever involved in lawsuits? Yes.
Yeah.
Should that be a question that's asked on character and fitness? Maybe, but then I think we have to have a discussion on what we're trying to get out of it in the first place, right? What are we seeking to accomplish by even having character or fitness here? Like, what is the purpose of it?
And circumstance can come into play, like you said. Like when you're in, politics, then you get sued all the time. So asking that question, it's like, well, yeah, of course. Like you can't just judge someone based on like if they've been sued without the context of it. Like, oh, well, they've been sued, so there's a mark against them or something. Like, well, no, this is kind of part of the arena in some way. So of course it's going to be on the record. So there has to be some context. And I'm sure, they've been doing this for decades. So they sift through the information and take that context, I would imagine.
Sure. But then the question again is, should people even have to be subjected to that line of questioning, or
right.
To what extent should they be questioned?
Right.
I guess I can understand civil lawsuits versus arrests, but I just got a message here on the subject. What if someone had arrests in their youth that were related to gangs, the mob, or cartels, and they become a lawyer for those gangs, the mob, or cartels? They knowingly will become lawyers to help cover and do illegal activities for these organizations. But I think those situations are not so common. I mean, right. I can see that, but
sure.
Again, if you were arrested but not charged, not convicted,
right?
Would you ever have to disclose that on any official application that you're submitting? Because, for example, when you're applying to a job, and this is why some people were saying it was already illegal in New York, because we banned the box. So now when you apply for a job, you don't have to disclose that kind of information anymore. So why should you when you're applying to become a lawyer?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I see that point, and then I also see the other side too, whereas I think a lawyer holds a different level of responsibility to a cashier at your local restaurant, because as a lawyer you're taking on responsibility and the faith and trust of clients, so there is a little bit of a higher responsibility there, in my opinion.
I agree, and that's why it gets to be more of a gray area or a nuanced discussion, right?
Right. So
it isn't only about background checks. I mean, they interview you and they're trying to discover whether you really would be a good lawyer. And so they'll say things like, the person seemed to understand complex legal ideas. Now, a lot of this obviously is tested at the bar itself, but when they interview, they want to kind of get a sense of what kind of person you are. Are you able to handle that responsibility of being a lawyer? Are you able to handle all these high pressure situations and also deal with clients and be able to communicate effectively with the client on the situation? Are you're not someone who's going to be a stain on the legal profession? So it isn't purely about do you have a clean criminal record, right? It's just about the kind of person you are in their judgment.
Right. Yeah. They're very interesting situation, and we also brought up issues before about how that can bar people from even being applying, or how it can be kind of discriminatory in many ways.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I also think, relating back to the big brother idea and kind of like the over intrusion, some of this feels like it is a bridge too far, just in terms of asking you of too much information, asking you to give up too much of yourself. I just got Verizon Fios hooked up and they did a background check. We had a conversation about, because I guess they want to see if you're going to be able to pay the cable bill. But to me, some of it just feels too much. We had a conversation several weeks ago about landlords sometimes asking for too much. And I understand the position of wanting to make sure that the person is a good person, who's going to be able to pay their bills and on top of their responsibilities and all that. But
Right.
I think there's also a danger of treating people like they're criminals or like they're bad people or like there's people to be suspicious of, cynical of. I don't think that has an overall positive effect on people's behavior and well-being.
Right. And I think, yeah, when that's applied too broadly in too many different areas, I think that definitely becomes a problem. In some areas where I think public trust and responsibility is in, there should be a little bit more scrutiny, I think.
No, I agree. But just think of that, right? You apply for an apartment, background checks, credit checks,
Yeah.
you know, we want tax returns, we want everything, letters of recommendation, all these different things, pay stubs,
Yeah.
you know, all your bank records, everything. You
Yeah.
drive now, we have a device that makes, you know, make sure you can't go over the speed limit. You try to get cable, background checks. You want to be a lawyer. Were you ever arrested? Do you have anything in your past? Were you ever sued? Were you ever suspended from school? It's, you know, it just seems like there's this movement to treat everyone like they
Right.
can't be trusted.
Right. Yeah.
And what is that old adage? When you start treating people like animals in cages, you know, you do that long enough, they start to react that way.
Right.
You know, I think,
Absolutely.
and that also
add
ties
to
back
that-
to the discussion we had last week about treating people like adults in the workplace, right? If you
Right.
give them more responsibility and flexibility and independence, they will behave accordingly. They'll behave like a team player, someone who's in it with the company and with everyone. We're all in this together, as opposed to being treated like someone who's inferior. Someone, right? This is an era of treating people like, you know, the system or whoever is in charge of this is better than the subjects. And I think that's a real danger, because then the subjects will act like subjects and not team players.
Right. And not care anymore. Like, you know, if you're going to treat me this way, then I have no stake in this. I have no equity in this. Why do I even care then? I'm looking for something else, something better.
Right. So I wanted to tell a story. Hold on a second. Okay, multitasking. The guest is rescheduling for next week at 2 p.m. And I'm confirming this right now.
All right.
So 7 p.m. next week, we will be back with the guest, hopefully. But we are
Right. Surprise guest.
right?
We won't disclose, just in case.
We won't disclose because our application does not require us to. I looked up over the wording. Jay, we're good on that one.
All right.
But
very good.
I wanted to tell a story about how politics has become people's entire identity. And actually, my mom told me about this. It was a friend of hers in Florida who had, I guess, someone from New Jersey moved down from New Jersey to Florida, and they drove with a U-Haul all their stuff from New Jersey to Florida, and they moved into this development. And I guess they accidentally knocked over a mailbox, caused some damage on the property. And so the person coming from New Jersey rang the bell. I think it was my mom's friend who lives in Florida. It was her, maybe her mailbox got knocked down or whatever. Rang the bell and introduced himself. This person coming from New Jersey, saying, "Hi, my name is such and such. I'm a Republican." That was his introduction to the person in Florida.
Why?
And my mom's friend said, "Hi, I'm such and such. I'm not." But I think the person assumed that everyone there was going to be Republican, or maybe because he was coming from New Jersey, that he was going to be written off as like some evil blue state Democrat. So he had to show that he was one of them and fit in. Or maybe he just carries his political identity outwardly like that to everyone. I don't know. But to me, that was very striking that this person introduced himself as, my name, I'm a Republican. That was his greeting to a stranger.
That's very weird. That's very strange, and that honestly raises a red flag about that person.
It does, right? And regardless of how they affiliate, just the fact that that's how they introduce themselves to.
Right. Yeah, and like, what do you say to that? You know, like, okay, so.
Yeah, no, my mom's friend, I'm not. That's what she said. I'm not.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think we're just so polarized right now. It's just very telling. And, you know, the guy came from New Jersey, and maybe he left New Jersey because he was a Republican. I mean, obviously that's a very important part of his identity, right? It's the first thing he says about himself. So maybe he thought that the state was too blue of a state for him, and he's going to go to Florida, and people there would be more receptive to him. And maybe he thought he wouldn't be accepted in this new community unless he said, otherwise he'd be written off as a New Jersey guy. And we all know New Jersey's they're all Democrats up there. I don't know, but crazy how polarized we are and how people have let politics become their whole identities.
Yeah, and it's been a kind of a slow march to this. I think it's really ramped up during the Trump presidency time, when people had very, very stark lines that they were marking, because it was so much craziness going on. There had to be these defined lines, but to show up and say, hey, my name is this, I'm a Republican, it's very weird. I mean, it would be weird if it was someone doing Democrat too, like, hey. So
right, what does it have to do with fixing someone's mailbox?
Yeah, did you hit my mailbox? That's yeah. I'm a Republican, I hit your mailbox. Like, that really is not relevant. Like, can you fix my mailbox?
Unless somehow he thought that was disarming the situation, like the person would be mad, but him saying that kind of lets him into the club somehow.
Oh, you're a Republican? Oh, it's okay, don't worry about the mailbox. Right. Now, if you're one of these dirty Democrats, then we had a problem. You're a Republican, I don't need a mailbox, it's okay.
Right, like he wouldn't be welcome in that part of Florida, that community, because he's coming from New Jersey, and they assume he's just one of those dirty Democrats.
Right, and honestly, it just if you're not a prick, you should be okay, whether you are that Republican or a Democrat or whatnot. It depends. It's going to depend on how you carry yourself. And I mean, of course, some of the positions that you may take are going to be very polarizing and can be discriminatory or bigoted one way or the other. But how often are you going to sit there and have those discussions with your neighbor, especially the first time meeting them? That's something that's going to come up later as you progress into your relationship, if there is one.
Right. And that used to be something that rarely even came up in polite society, right? We don't talk politics and religion. We talk weather. Maybe that's boring, but that was something we were taught as kids, that's a very polarizing, divisive topic that most people would stay away from.
And I mean, I understand how it is. That's what's happening right now, because of we've had very, very polarizing years, and we've had let's say Trump broke a lot of norms in regards to
and social media in general. I think people started sharing articles all the time and commenting their thoughts.
Right, the rise of the niche being able to reach greater audiences because social media, whether they were savvy, whether it went viral, whether someone's searching for this type of validation, so I understand how that all happens, but to go that far to be like, hey, I guess that would be kind of similar if he wanted to make that statement, just showing up and knocking on the door with a MAGA hat on,
Right. It actually reminded me of that Curb Your Enthusiasm scene from, I think the episode was called Happy New Year, the first episode of that particular season, either 9 or 10, where he had that MAGA hat that he wore because he didn't want to take a meeting with people, he didn't want to be around people. So he actually wore it to make people disgusted of him and repulsed by him. But then he also wore it to get himself out of hostile situations. Like there was this biker guy who I think he cut off on a highway or something like that, and the guy was about to fight him, so he put the hat on thinking that, a biker is more likely to be pro-Trump, and maybe that will diffuse the situation, and it worked on the show. So
right,
it does remind me of that.
Yeah, it's a really weird situation. You gotta be the best you. And the politics, we're gonna have our beliefs and we're gonna have the things that we support, but to make the party your whole identity, especially if you're not a politician, I mean, it's very strange.
It is, and I don't think it's necessarily a good thing.
No. Yeah. It's in the chat said it's been like this since Bush, and since each president's gotten worse. I would say Bush was probably the a modern catalyst in that, but you go further, I think Reagan was also a big one, because he was very polarizing.
The Bush point is interesting though because of 9/11, and we just
Right.
had 9/11, but after 9/11, it seemed like more of that ugliness came to the forefront, and it seemed almost socially acceptable in some ways to be hateful.
Well, it was, and I've said that many times over. 9/11 is what really was the seed for a lot of this divisiveness right now, because after 9/11, it became okay to hate someone because of where they're from and their background. It became okay to hate Muslims because they were seen as entire population that attacked us, and so it became acceptable. And so the people who have been quiet all these decades while the rest of the country decided this sort of mentality and this sort of way of thinking is not acceptable, that doesn't mean the feelings go away. It's like now that it's out, it's like, oh, so I can let that out. Okay, so then it became an issue. Now it's not just Muslims. Now we're back to talking about blacks. We're back to talking about Mexicans and immigrants. And oh, here's a black president. Oh my God, now we can talk about this. Here are the gays. Okay, let's get on this. Oh my God, these people coming over the border, they want to be treated like humans. Okay, well let's. And so all of this was it started there, but once you open that Pandora's box,
right, it was like open season on xenophobia.
Right, and we had worked for decades to make that precedent that this is not okay to think about in public, or to be about in public. Of course, you can't legislate people's feelings, but you can make some things that are unacceptable in public. And this bigotry and the xenophobia and stuff was not something that was okay. So it didn't start with Trump. Trump was, he was riding that wave and just was doing it in a very grandiose manner.
Yeah.
So, but Reagan has his fair share. Anything beyond that, I don't.
Nixon.
Yeah, Nixon. So Reagan had a massive impact on the way everything changed. And so the thing is, people tend to forget from president to president. Like when it was Bush, everyone was like, oh my God, Republicans, get them out. And then it got to Obama, and they're like, oh my God, we need to bring back Republicans. And then it gets to Trump. Oh, they tend to forget.
Right. That's why the midterms usually favor the opposition party. If you have one party in the White House, the other party generally wins the midterms. I mean, you have some exceptions like after 9/11 and that kind of thing, but that's usually how it goes. It's very cyclical. You won't usually have a president in power from the same party for too long. It goes back and forth.
Right. And it's more, I think that speaks to kind of the fickle nature of people, and also the want of quicker resolutions, changing time.
That's all true. It's also the Yelp review factor, right? When you go to a restaurant and it's great, you're less likely to leave a glowing Yelp review than you would if you went to a restaurant and it was bad. Like, people just want to complain. They're more motivated to complain about the bad stuff. So if you have anyone who's in office doing good things, the good things aren't going to be talked about as much as the bad things, the things people don't like. Sure. And so the opposition voices are always louder and stronger than people who support.
Right, because the assumption is, and how it, the ideal is that, things should be good. There shouldn't be any issue. And so when it is good, it's like, you don't feel that need to leave a glowing review or talk it up, because it's how it should be. But when it is some kind of a bad experience, it's like, it's strayed away from that. Now it's time to complain about it.
Right. And it's also human nature. I mean, I think myself, for example, if something really bad happens, something I perceive as bad happens, I feel a lower low than I feel a high when something good happens, if that makes sense. Like we almost, like you
Right.
said, expect things to be going well. So they say, no news is good news. You just kind of like living your life, thinking, oh, this is fine, everything's working the way it's supposed to work. I don't think we do enough to celebrate our successes or our highs in life, right? I think we as humans focus too much on the negative things that happen to us. But when something equally positive happens, we don't feel it with that same force that we do feel the bad.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, yeah, interesting. Calling it the yoke review thing, but yeah, I mean, it's very true in that situation.
Yeah. So we should put the poll question out for next week.
Sure.
We were asking about what, the cars?
Yeah, I think the cars was a good poll to find out.
Okay. So here we go. Our question for the week is, do you believe that cars in New York State should have devices pre-installed to prevent drivers from speeding?
Yeah. It's a very crazy thing to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. And we are told next week we will have a guest.
Yes.
We're scheduled for this week. I guess there was a mix up, but we will, as far as we know, next week this guest will be with us. If not, I'm sure we'll have someone else joining us. But
Right.
looking forward to that conversation. And you get the bottom line 2 weeks in a row, Jay?
I think we'll give the bottom line to you this time.
Oh, wow. Okay. How about this? Trying to tie all of these things together. The bottom line is, let's put more trust in ourselves. Let's not be so quick to punish people and to rush to the negative and to treat people and situations cynically, but let's incentivize good behavior and celebrate good behavior and not focus so much on the negatives.
I think that's a pretty good bottom line right there.
All right. That kind of ties all the themes together.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing for everything.
All right.
But
Well, I want to shout out, before we wrap up, I want to shout out Jeremy Bucaria on here, who actually rolled with me to the QCYD event from Howard Beach. And I know he's joined us a few times on Nuance.
That's what's up.
Yeah, thank you to Vladimir for tuning in. I see Vladimir in the chat. James obviously always joining us. Lixa. Yeah, thank you to everyone for tuning in every week.
Yeah, and you can follow us on YouTube. Look up Nuance with Mike Scala and Jay Carter on YouTube. And if you do podcasts, they're also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, wherever you do your podcasts. So go on there, subscribe. And if you've got something that you'd like to say to continue the conversation, you can leave it in the comments on the YouTube channel. So for example, I see someone here, in answer to the poll question, says partly. So if you want to flesh out your idea there, you can leave it in the chat here or go on YouTube and post it there to get that conversation going so that these conversations can be had.
All right. Well, thank you all. We will catch you next week.